Arlington National Cemetery is the final resting place for more than 400,000 American veterans and spouses. There are veterans of each war and armed conflict which has engaged those in the military in defense of our nation and its interests overseas. The cemetery is on a high bluff above the Potomac River and faces the Lincoln Memorial across the river. Hundreds of thousands of white grave markers fill the gentle slope down to the river. To see these thousands of grave markers that cover the land as far as the eye can see is to be aware of the magnitude of what this cemetery represents. It is listed on the National Register of Historic Places, which is the nation's official list of cultural resources worthy of preservation. Authorized under the Historic Preservation Act of 1966, the National Register is part of a national program to coordinate and to support public and private efforts to identify, evaluate, and protect our historic and archaeological treasures and resources. Properties listed on the register include districts, sites, buildings, structures, and objects that are significant in American history. The National Register is administered by the National Park Service, which is part of the U.S. Department of the Interior. On Memorial Day every year, the 800 acres of the cemetery will be filled by the families, widows, widowers, children, and grandchildren of those buried here. The same will be repeated on Veterans Day. A large gathering of family, of patriotic groups, and of those who simply wish to pay homage and show their respect to those who have gone before. For the past 13 years, there has been a new tradition as Wreaths Across America has joined with patriotic and service groups to help place a fresh greenery wreath with bright red bow on each of the more than 200,000 individual white markers. The estate that is now on that property overlooking the Potomac was begun by George Washington Parke Custis. He meant it to be a living memorial to the first president's daughter. Custis's daughter Mary had married her cousin, Robert E. Lee, in 1831. When Custis died in 1857, he left his estate, Arlington, to his daughter, Mary Custis Lee, for the duration of her life, and upon her death, that her eldest son would inherit the property. Robert E. Lee never owned the property, although that seems to be a rather frequent misconception. After the Lees left the property at the start of the Civil War, the U.S. Army seized the Arlington estate on the morning of May 24, 1861, preparing to defend Washington, D.C. It has been noted that because of the elevation of that property, it allowed line of sight to artillery firing for any of the public buildings in the then smaller city of Washington. Arlington officially became a national cemetery on June 15, 1864. The first military burial had been conducted on the estate May 13, 1864. By order of the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, the cemetery was made a national cemetery for military remains. The original cemetery had been 200 acres. The original land of Arlington Estate was at least 10 times that. The cemetery has continued to grow to nearly 800 acres as of last year. The first official decoration day, later renamed Memorial Day, was indeed held at Arlington Cemetery on May 30th, 1868, a mere 3 years after the end of the Civil War. Continuing that tradition to the present, as I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, families by the hundreds, if not thousands, gather to visit the grave of their beloved veteran ancestor and to stand and pause for a moment and to remember the sacrifice that represented for that family, to preserve the freedom of that family, and for all of us. Following that tradition, beginning in the late 1870s, high-ranking veterans began to request burial in the officer sections of Arlington Cemetery. In 1899, the U.S. government began repatriating at its own expense service members who had died overseas in the Spanish-American War. Arlington National Cemetery was then expanded to include new sections 21, 22, and 24. In 1900, Congress authorized a designated section for Confederate soldiers' graves. This was a time when the nation was hoping different means to reconcile and to become more united after the Civil War, even so many years, decades before. The Confederate section, also known as Jackson Circle, Section 16, for Stonewall Jackson, contains the graves of 482 veterans of the Confederate armies and navies and their spouses. Until that time, it had been the policy that Confederates could not be buried in cemeteries with Union forces, and it remained the case even after this action to bring us together, that non-white veterans could not be buried in sections with white veterans. There were separate numbered areas. After World War I, more than 2,000 service members were repatriated to Arlington National Cemetery. The Tomb of the Unknown Soldier was dedicated November 11th. In 1921, with the internment of an unknown from World War I. An honored unit of the Old Guard ensures the sanctity of the tomb, patrolling constantly 24 hours a day in rain, sun, and other weather. Every year with every conflict that has had unidentified remains, there has been one selected to represent his or her, possibly, fellow service personnel who had died in that conflict. Bearing in mind that there are still remains being found from Vietnam and even Korea. President John F. Kennedy became the second of two presidents to be buried at Arlington. His widow, Jacqueline, was also buried here when she died later. By the 1980s, to prevent the cemetery from running out of space, the United States government authorized further expansion and restricted eligibility for in-ground burial. The Calabrium units were also created for ashes above ground interments. 11 veterans of the American Revolutionary War are buried here. They all died years or even decades after the Revolutionary War and were buried somewhere else. But they remind us that this cemetery does reflect the entire span of American military history. And I urge you, if you have the opportunity, to go stand there and see what 200,000 white headstones look like. Thank you very much.